On signing the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA, into law on October 25, 1994, President Clinton said, and I quote, "After several years of intense efforts, manufacturers, experts in nutrition, and legislators, acting in a conscientious alliance with consumers at the grassroots level, have moved successfully to bring common sense to the treatment of dietary supplements under regulation and law." Now, the industry was valued at about $4 billion back then, with about 4,000 products on the market. Today, it's between $40 and $50 billion, and there are upwards of 80,000 products around. While the world has changed significantly over the last 2.5 decades, the regulations underlying dietary supplements have endured, with a few key amendments. Now, over the course of the next hour, we are going to take a deep dive into DSHEA. We're going to go on a little trip down memory lane. We're going to look at how the industry has evolved over the last 25 years, and then we're going to talk about what comes next. And who better to lead us on this little trip than two of the key architects of the actual law? I am very pleased to be joined by Loren Israelsen, who is president of the United Natural Products Alliance, and Scott Bass, who is a partner at Sidley Austin. Now, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
It is.
So now, I'm going to start off and say the doors are locked. We're not leaving here until we get through all of my questions. But don't worry, if you get hungry, I have a salami sandwich that you can share. And I believe there is a story about doors being locked in a pastrami sandwich. Am I right, Loren?
You are correct.
You want to lead me off?
Yeah,
Take me back to that night.
We are locked up in it was the Russell Building, as I recall. And this was the negotiating team. We were down to the final days of DSHEA. And we were literally locked into a room, and the deal was, if anybody left, that was it. You were out of the room. So there were no breaks, there was no food, and Scott and I were sitting next to each other, and little do I know that he smuggled in a sandwich. So I'm beginning to hear the little rustling sounds. I look over, and the next thing I see is that he's slipping me a half a sandwich so that we can just try and stay in the game here, on the view that this was going to go for quite a while. And so one of the many memories of the DSHEA era is where Scott and I were flying wingman for each other over what was really a remarkable ride that deserves to be told. The story has never been fully told, so we appreciate this opportunity.
All right, so take me back, Scott, to that night, and then we'll go back a little bit further before then. Those last few hours of DSHEA, I imagine it's very tense. People are haggling over some of the things. It could even be make or break at some point. Take us back. What is that like?
What people don't realize is this unanimously passed law was actually passed only because of the brilliance of the strategy of Senator Orrin Hatch. What happened was Loren and I were in that last-ditch effort to revive the law that he just described. We spent, 10 hours in the basement. And then the following week, our counter-negotiator, Congressman Waxman's lead person, had made a deal in the Senate to kill the bill. So the Senate kept the clock, as they often do. The session ended for the year at midnight, but it was now almost 3 a.m., and they moved the clock back in their hands. And 5 minutes before the end of the session, or 10 minutes, Metzenbaum pulled DSHEA as a matter of right. But Senator Hatch had been prepared with all of the liberal Democratic federal judicial nominees and pulled those. So in the last minute, suddenly there was a hand vote, I guess, unanimously passing a law, and then in the House. And that law, after 2.5 years of contentious, wild behavior, became the law.
Wow. So take me back to the early 90s now, because this was a period of just immense activity in and around supplements, right? So in 1990, you have the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, which was kind of set the rules for health claims. You got FDA stating that herbs were not eligible for health claims because they were not recognized as nutrients.
Correct.
And then you got Senator Hatch floating a one-page bill that then grew into the Health Freedom Act of 1992.
By the way, you mentioned that. I remember Loren and I became good friends in 1990 when we were drafting the NLEA exception for supplements. And then I remember to this day that DSHEA really started in a call between Loren and me in December of '91 on a snowy day when we were all flying in to Colorado for a meeting of industry, and we looked at each other and said, this is it. The FDA has fired the shot across the bow on that statement that you made about herbs not being nutritional. And that's when Loren, the people in Utah, went to Hatch, and that's how it started.
So it was very much Utah that was the driving force of this.
It was a centerpiece. Several reasons that Senator Hatch, who I had known since the late 70s, having worked in his office in his first year of his first term. And he is a true believer. He uses dietary supplements. He respects the natural health and wellness philosophy, practices it. And he had long said to many of our friends in Utah that should the time come and you need my help, let me know. And the cascade of events that Scott mentions began to build up. On top of that, there were other crazy things that were happening. It was the raid on Dr. Jonathan Wright's clinic in Tacoma, Washington, that sparked a fury in the media in the Northwest. And this is a guns drawn, flak jackets, everybody on the ground raid of a doctor's office. He was using injectable vitamin B12 and selling supplements. For this interview, I pulled the file out and just reread the clippings at that time, and it just immediately took me back to just the energy of the time, that there was this growing foreboding in our industry that FDA had been taking aggressive actions against companies, that this task force report that FDA issued in June of 1992 was alarming. And
so this is the one that was amino acids should be regulated as drugs.
Correct.
Because of L-tryptophan.
This was known as the Dykstra report, after Gary Dykstra, who was a senior official at FDA, who had the misfortune of chairing this task force. A very nice guy. And he had the unfortunate job of taking this assignment on. When you read the report, if there was any doubt in anyone's mind what the future was as far as FDA was concerned, it was right there in text. That vitamins would be capped based on potency. That was the working premise, and that they would use the OTC monograph process to do that. Amino acids would largely be seen as drugs, and others, as it was then called, would remain food additives to allow FDA maximum enforcement discretion. Well, that coupled with the NLEA, which had cut out non-nutrients, and Scott and I and others were desperately trying to get Congress to understand that they were doing something good, creating health claims, but in the course of doing that, they had created a real problem for all of these non-nutrient products. They didn't have time to deal with it. NLEA passes, so that was when the clock really began to tick in terms of something is likely to happen. And then in '92, you have this boom, boom, boom of events. And in Utah, being an epicenter of the industry, there was a deep sense of threat.
Did you say an epicenter?
An
How can
epicenter.
something be an epicenter?
A epicenter.
Oh, Jesus.
I've always been correct.
You know, just Loren. By the way, one thing
The
to
English
add,
teacher.
Here's a very good point you made. This goes back to 1964. So
Yeah.
Utah became a big player in the late 70s, but starting in '64, you had people in the East who were rebelling against all these vitamin mineral limits, and there were major cases against FDA for a period of 10 years, which they lost, by the way. And citizen marches on Washington in 1973, leading to the Proxmire amendments in 1973. And so this was all, actually you're right, that it wasn't just the whole effort by Commissioner Kessler, it was also 30 or 40 years of resentment and bad court decisions, and FDA using crazy theories to keep products, as Loren said, as food additives so they could have pre-approval authority. So really built up, and you had two groups always. I always found it interesting. You had the far right and the far left. You had the hippies
It's true.
and the far right.
It's true that it was a very odd collection of political views, of regionality in the industry, that there's a very distinct northeast corridor in Long Island in particular. You had the Utah culture, and then you had the West Coast, which was essentially seen as the hippie community within the industry. And when you got these three sets together, it was hilarious. You could tell who was who with one glance. You knew who was...
It was Messianic, and it was religious. At least 2/3 of it was religious.
Yeah, and a third were high, and a third were sober, and a third were cutting deals on the side.
Exactly.
It was a strange combination of players that got together, but under a common banner. And with any interesting movement, you typically see that. And this was certainly true of our industry, is that we had a common enemy, as it were, and a common objective. And we set aside a lot of the usual differences that would express itself in the course of the industry. But we did see over the course of DSHEA that flared often, is that we had as much trouble trying to negotiate within the industry as we were dealing with members of Congress that were on the other side of the table. And it was not without note that very often people were trying to cut side deals. And it was a sense of allegiance, I think, is that you really had to trust people.
Yes.
That when you're in a room and you're working on very sensitive negotiations, that it's paramount that it stays in the room. And I think that's one thing that Scott and I had an absolute trust with each other, that it was in the vault. It was protected for sure.
So who were some of the key personalities back then from all these different factions, and who was responsible for?
Other than Loren? Well, I guess Jerry Kessler, who passed away.
Yeah,
right?
Jerry Kessler would have to
Talk about messianic.
be on the list. Jerry was a very unusual, colorful guy, very tall. He had a very distinctive booming voice. He also physically was quite distinct, that you would always know Jerry was coming just by his gait. And he had a very clear sense, literally messianic, not making that up. And
Yes, quite.
it was Scott's job to try and manage Jerry. You're both East Coast guys, you deal with each other. Jerry was hard to manage, but Scott did it as well as anybody could. And he comes to mind. Jerry had a ranch right next to Michael Jackson in California. So we had, I think, was it Neverland? Mm-hmm. And then we had Jerryland. And there were a couple of meetings at his ranch that were interesting.
Where everyone was jockeying to be leaders, and he and I would be sitting there on the Hill and elsewhere saying, sure, 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 and trying to keep these people, give them their, and then we had the citizens groups, remember?
Yes, Citizens for Health was an important group. There were a number of people that were involved in that. That became a real grassroots entity that did a lot of hard work and made a real difference trying to
Well, there was
rally.
a true story, right, that the phones rang off the hook so much that the legislators couldn't get calls out, and they had more calls and letters on this than on any issue since the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And that was coordinated, or that was?
Yes, that was coordinated.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody. We had a blackout day of all retail stores.
Multiple
covered
blackout
products.
days. Yeah. They would cover in some black, whatever black you wanted. Just cover the supplement section. Customers would walk in. What's the deal with this? And to say, that's what your future looks like if you don't sign this petition and make a phone call. So on the checkout counter normally would be a phone, and there would be a petition form. And remember, this is 92 to 94. This is pre-internet. The DSHEA passes and the internet is born the next morning is basically what happened.
we really missed that. But, you know, it's interesting. Loren always had a better handle on the core concept, because I was trying to draft a law, and so the concept, the overriding concept, which he understood very deeply, was freedom of choice. I kept saying, hey, wait, that's not a legal concept. And Loren would talk to me and say, yeah, but we've got to remember that's what's unifying everyone. And that was it. That was the unifying
That was the
concept.
unifying principle. And interestingly, today is Tuesday. Yesterday, Monday, Commissioner Gottlieb issues a press statement noting that now 25 years after the anniversary of DSHEA, here we are, that FDA is interested in updating its process, procedures, and its views of how dietary supplements should be regulated. And they noted, interestingly, that they felt it would be appropriate to examine amendments to DSHEA. And that's another fascinating point we'll no doubt get to, is how durable this statute was in terms of its watertight welding. And a lot of people tried to crack it open over the years.
But you know, you and I never wanted one change. I've actually changed my mind because of this mandatory listing issue, and also because I know the FDA we have now is the best FDA we'll get. It's an FDA that actually believes. I thought that announcement gave credibility for the first time in 50 years by FDA to the legitimacy of this industry, to innovation, but also called, Loren and I have talked about this, I think the industry has never grown up and hasn't taken on responsibilities it needs to, and it's time for a change on both sides.
I want to get to the Gottlieb stuff right at the end, because then we'll kind of look forward. So I want to kind of pull you back.
Sorry, we jumped ahead, yeah.
It's all right, it's all right. So yeah, pulling you back to when, and Scott, when you were drafting it, and you were, how quickly did it come together as a law? How much, chopping and changing?
Loren was heavily involved in a lot of the key provisions later, but it started out from Bill Richardson. Congressman Richardson introduced the first bill, which was an agglomeration. We had a meeting at my office, and Loren, of course, was a key player there, where everybody just gave us what they cared about, the 9 things they cared about. That went in as the first DSHEA law. And then it went to Hatch's office, where it was rewritten, and every single word, every definition became a major rallying cry. People accused each other. They had lawsuits over provisions. So he and I kept a steady hand, as he said, he with the rather, how can I say, active Utah folks who always wanted to take charge. And he kept everybody in line. And I wasn't as successful as some people in Washington, but there were a lot of groups trying to take credit all the time, and it was he and I really who were behind the doors. But it was interesting to watch, and I think to your point or question, what happened there was the fundamental concepts didn't change from day one. No food additive, meaning no prior approval. Announcements in the industry of enforcement. No drug treatment, no backdoor GMPs that would treat them as drugs. And the ability to have literature, it was called the balanced food case, have literature available on everything for people under the First Amendment. I guess those would be the primary.
There were keys, and I think that the starting point is what is now Section 201 of the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act is the definition section. And we felt it was paramount to redefine what is a dietary supplement, bearing in mind that that term didn't lawfully exist until the statute passed.
So 94 was the first formal definition.
That is the first time that there was an actual legal definition of dietary supplement.
Did you mention, by the way, as the representative of the herb industry, that an herb is not really a dietary supplement? That's the irony of this whole law. Herbs are drugs, but FDA, he tried for years to get FDA to acknowledge them as traditional medicines. He even got ambassadors and others, and they just refused.
Yeah, they were not. They were not.
So this was, DSHEA was the tail that wagged the dog. It was about a drug category, herbs, being the lead in supplements.
Yeah, that is a really key point. One of the interesting battles, and this is where you saw the two factions of the industry really go at each other, is that there was one group that much preferred the term nutritional supplement. And then there was the other group that insisted that it had to be dietary, because on that, those two words would hang all the difference. Right. Nutritional has a very specific understanding. Dietary is anything that you add to the diet. And that crafting of thought and language was very intentional. And if you look back at the drafts, and I've got many boxes of the old original drafts, is that you can see the markups back and forth, where dietary would be stricken out, replaced by nutritional, and then back the other way. And this went on for quite a long time.
Still going on. 201 FF1E is still the fight over that. We took nutritional out, and FDA lawyers are still trying to put it back.
So we knew, we became very, very clear about what the fundamentals had to be and where the line had to be drawn. And that turned out to be a key one. Literature was really important. Again, this is Amazon was founded in 1994 as a point of reference. And so if you look at the evolution of what has happened from then to now on that side of the world, and you look at DSHEA, which was formed against the backdrop of 40, 50 years of history, that we really, I think, understood pretty clearly what had to change in order to protect consumer access to supplements, but also something that could be defended in court. And that led to a lot of interesting examples that we discussed in detail. How do you take a dietary supplement? It had to be ingested. Well, there was litigation over dietary supplements that you would squirt up your nose, put in your ears, on the skin. And we have always, Scott and I resolutely said, the statute's really clear, is that you need to ingest it. Now, how exactly you do that when you put it in your mouth, there's some room for discussion there. But these, and many people say, these are details. I say, yeah, these are the details that matter,
Yeah, exactly.
that on which an industry turns.
Exactly.
That investors are willing to put in a great deal of money because their lawyers tell them that that's pretty secure. Yeah, you can make an investment based on what we've read here.
And what compromises did you make along the way? Did you?
I think the biggest compromise was in the definitions, what Loren's saying. You know, one of the provisions that he's talking about at FF is the definition section. Sub 3 is what we call the race to market. If it was a drug first, it can't be a supplement, although now there's a dispute about what if the drug was abandoned. But that was a big one. And also, there was much stronger feeling, particularly in Utah, having no manufacturing standards set forth. And that was, I wouldn't say compromise, but essential view. Loren and I have always been of the same mind. We have been the fiercest defenders against all changes to this, as you called it, the welded together statute. But as I said too, and we'll get to it later, I think that time has changed, meaning now after 25 years. But I think the big compromises, Loren, as I recall in that last meeting in the basement, were the definition provision on other ingredients.
Yeah.
It was partial, but although we won on nutritional. And then I guess the limitations that they put on the structure function claims, right?
Yeah, that was a clear compromise, as what we now call structure function claims. Where we had to compromise is that if you look at the title of that section 6, it's statements of nutritional support. Mm-hmm. That's where we couldn't get the word dietary changed. And that was one that we, end of the day, agreed to live with. I wish we could have had a harmonious definition, dietary, throughout, but that one, and we knew then, and we have seen it since, is that has been a problem going
and
forward.
Health claims, people mistakenly thought they needed health claims. I've always been of the view that they're worthless for supplements anyway because they're too long, but people fought very hard for those, and we didn't get what some people wanted.
In fact, what we now call structure function claims turned out to be something quite desirable that the food industry wishes they had.
Yes.
The pharma industry feels that we've encroached onto what the consumer perception is of a health benefit for products, and that if you line these products up, OTC drug, a fiber product and a dietary supplement, food drug, and dietary supplement, can you really tell them apart? And we felt that would likely be the case, that there would be a convergence over time, and that
there is
proven out
right?
true. That's what's
the
happening.
January 6, 2000 Federal Register notice on structure function claims, there is exactly what you said. 6 years later, convergence.
Yeah, we
Well,
saw.
actually, I read an article that you wrote, Scott, and I think you said that, you know, with the passage of DSHEA, basically like 40% or something of the OTC was ceded to dietary supplements.
Is that the figure I used?
I'm
I hope not.
paraphrasing. It was sizable.
It was a big number. Yeah, I don't know what it was, but it was a pretty
The line
big
they
number.
drew is between occasional versus recurrent, meaning if you have, for example, sleep product for constant sleep use, it's a drug, but if it's occasional sleeplessness, it's a supplement. Same thing with constipation and with fiber and all that stuff.
Chronicity has turned out to be an important distinguishing point. Mm-hmm. The other one, as I'm thinking this through, is that on the NDI provision, we had a terrible time trying to come up with a working process. And that was one of the last things that was put into the bill. We'd worked out a lot of the other parts, and then there was a lot of concern on the part of Senator Kennedy specifically and Henry Waxman and their staffers, who were very capable people. Bill Schultz, who was the staffer for Waxman, was and is an exceptionally bright, capable guy. And part of the fun of DSHEA, using that term advisedly, is that there were a lot of extremely capable people that were in these final negotiating sessions.
On both sides.
On both sides.
That's a good point. You know, actually 413 never worked. It's got too many contrary definitions. It's where the grandfather process is and new dietary ingredients. But one of the things that has to be fixed by FDA now, in fact, is that. And I think we know how to do it.
Yeah, I agree. That I think we felt that we had not fully resolved the whole NDI approach and process. The definitional piece, which is not actually in the statute, It's in separate language that defines what constitutes a change.
Right.
I wish we could have had something that was more clear and robust. We didn't have time.
Yep. I did want to talk about the little disclaimer that you see on all the packages as well.
Oh, yes.
You know,
That's a
this
great
statement is
story.
not being evaluated by FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent any disease. Where did that come
Can
from?
I tell you a funny story? That comes from the same source as 413, Bill Schultz. But I'm going to tell you something
Yes.
funny about this. I'm driving the day before the bill passed, and I get a call that the whole thing's being killed because one of the trade associations had some large members who thought it would be a problem selling the product. I said, are you kidding? Call Loren. He'll tell you the same thing I will, which is that's going to be an asset in selling the product that it wasn't approved.
That's
And
a
sure
badge
enough-
of honor.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody reads that, number one. And number two, the fact it's not approved is for consumers a
To
positive.
our consumer,
Yeah.
it was no problem.
Yeah.
So I recall I was hunkered over a fax machine with Peter and Trish that were Senator Hatch and Harkin's chiefs, at that time, health policy staffers. As I remember, Scott was, I was on the Senate side. I can't remember where I was, but Scott was trying to control fires someplace else. And we were waiting for a response from the Waxman office. And we had proffered this. No, actually, they proffered the
That's
language.
right. That's right.
They sent it over, and I remember the fax kicking on, and the old thermal paper rolls out. And we look at this, and they said, if you will accept this wording, we're good. And we looked at it, looked at each other, and said, we're go. And we sent it back to Schultz. And there was this incredulous, you're really willing to accept that?
They thought that would kill it?
They thought that would kill it. If there was one miscalculation in retrospect on their side, that was it.
You know why? Because the player he relied upon, you know who I'm talking about,
Yeah.
told him it would be a killer, but nobody else thought it was.
That worked out. So the language went on, and I don't think it's an overstatement to say that they were dumbfounded. Because in their worldview, why would anyone buy a product that would carry such a disclaimer? I said, well, you clearly don't know our consumers.
That's right.
Okay, so you've got everything kind of ready to go. This is the 103rd Congress, if I remember, if my research is right.
That is correct.
You had a Democrat in the White House. You had Democratic majorities in both chambers. You had some big names, like you've already mentioned, Waxman, Kennedy, who were not very supportive of this.
Metzenbaum.
That's a
Dingle.
Dingle was very
Dingle.
important.
Yeah,
Very important.
and yet this went through. So how did that look behind the scenes playing?
Well, I'll
playing
tell you
that
about
game?
one meeting. Were you there at the Richardson meeting after it passed through Senate committee? We had a meeting.
Pretty sure. Yeah, yeah, I was.
Five of us were there, and he looked at us, tie loose, and said, look, I'm not your boy, Orrin. He said, this bill's dead. It's not going anywhere. Unless Orrin can cross from the Senate and the House and save it, it's over. This is 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before it passed. So that's when the famous meeting with Loren and me in the basement, Hatch called up Dingle, who was on the other side, but you know, they had a lot of, in those days, people in opposite parties actually worked together occasionally. And so he said, do me a favor, have your senior staffer, he had a brilliant senior staffer, put together a meeting, and Trish Knight came over, she was, and Peter, you know, great staff members who were really smart, and that's the meeting we had to save the bill. It was basically dead 3-4 weeks before it passed, and that was the behind the scenes that I saw. I don't know what you saw.
Yeah, you know, this is the Rasputin bill. It lived and died more times than you can imagine. That moments of elation where we thought, we think we finally got this thing. The problem is this never went through a markup in the House. Never. That is extremely unusual for a major piece of legislation to pass without ever going through a markup on one of the two chambers. I was concerned, for the same reason Scott was, is that the setup had been organized basically is to hand the live grenade to the Senate side. The driver, there were two things. One is that the Republican wave, you could feel in Congress that they could see that the Democrats were probably going to get wiped out. And somewhere along the light went on for some of these key senior leadership offices is you know, this very, very pesky group that wants this dietary supplement bill are driving a tremendous numbers of consumers. We have seen them. The calls, the faxes, the rallies, is if we can work a deal out, maybe that will dissipate a lot of the anger that would likely be channeled against the Democrats in the November 94 elections. In my view, that was a motivator. The Speaker of the House was Tom Foley. Mm-hmm. He lost in that election that followed. Newt Gingrich came into power as the Speaker, and Foley, the Democrat from Washington State, was defeated. So the midnight passage of the bill on the House side was remarkable. And then the handoff to the Senate side was, now you guys can take care of business because the procedural rules are different. Any member of the Senate can pick up the phone, which happened to be Senator Metzenbaum, to put a hold on the bill, and that would effectively kill it. So as you're going through these final UC or unanimous consent read-ins, well, all you got to do is put the bill on hold. It gets literally pulled out of a stack. And unless you can get it back into a stack, that they'll get read through, gavel is done, and everybody's out of there.
And that was all set up the day we had that basement meeting. When we reached agreement with Waxman's person, he set it up so that whatever we agreed to would be killed at the last minute.
We were not
unaware
of that.
Yes.
And part of the challenge was to figure out who would be the sniper. And we had 3 or 4 ideas of who it might be.
But those two, don't forget, drafted Hatch Waxman together.
That's right. So it was a really unusual dynamic as between Senator Hatch and Senator Kennedy, very good friends. As everyone knows, a very unlikely combination of personalities and political views, but you had the same with Senator Hatch and Harkin. I mean, Tom Harkin really came onto the scene and did a masterful job to really carry the water on the Democratic side of the Senate.
Yes.
And so this is really, that, as it was referred to very often, the Hatch-Harkin bill. And what still is a testament to how Congress should work is those two offices, the Hatch-Harkin offices, had a highly trusted relationship between their staffers, who are still very active in the industry, thankfully, because they carry an institutional knowledge of what happened. And that will become very important now as we're going into what some will refer to as the DSHEA 2.0 time period.
I also want to talk about David Kessler. So he was commissioner of the FDA at the time. And there was an article that was authored by Peter Barton Hutt, who's obviously a name that everyone in the industry knows. And he had made this statement. He said, in retrospect, the entire dietary supplement industry owes its current stature and economic strength to Kessler. Without him, DSHEA would never have been enacted. It was his arrogance and political insensitivity that allowed the champions of dietary supplements to carry their message to the American people, and it was the American people that rejected Kessler's attempt to ban dietary supplements. I have often remarked that the dietary supplement industry should erect a monument to him in commemoration of his tremendous service to the industry.
I will tell you a very funny story that embodies that. So Loren and I was called by Commissioner Kessler, the 15 people who led the industry effort. I shouldn't say 15, it was fewer than that because Trish and Peter were there. And we were summoned into a round major office of the commissioner where he had everybody behind him standing in public service whites, essentially Navy uniforms, white hat, white uniform. He had 2 desks facing each other, each about 15 feet long. He sat in the center of one. Loren and I sat with another lawyer in the center of the other. And the meeting began as follows. He stood up and yelled and pointed his finger at me and said, "Scott, you can't win." That's how the meeting started. This was August of 1993. So I looked around, conferred with Loren. I said, "You can't win. It's not about money." And that is, to me, the embodiment of everything you just asked about.
Yeah.
He was a brilliant guy, still is. And I think there was historical antipathy towards supplements. It goes back to medical school since post-World War II, and that carried over, and that arrogance was just an assumption that you can run because so many of the players were, shall we say, not university professors.
Yes. it was highly unusual for an FDA commissioner to get that personally and politically involved in any bill before Congress. That is highly unusual. Normally, FDA stands off, and HHS, the parent agency, will do that sort of liaison work with the Congress. And this is an exception to that general principle. And as Scott said earlier, and I fully agree, is that we have an opportunity with the current commissioner, who I believe has both understood the lessons of the past, and he brings a very different view and a very different temperament to this discussion that we will be having. And that is a very encouraging sign, and that the leadership at the Office of Dietary Supplements at FDA likewise has shown, I would say, not only a spirit of cooperation, but a sincere interest to continue to allow broad consumer access, but to carry out their mandate, which is the point they're making.
I agree with that. It's a total different attitude.
And that will be all the difference if we end up back in Congress, if we all conclude that there is a pathway to look at. And that we'll get to that, I'm sure, in the conversation about what will that look like as we reflect on.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to talk about some of the various provisions in DSHEA, and so we're kind of moving on now into that intermediate period. Let's look at the last 25 years. So GMPs, they were part of DSHEA, and they came in 2007, 2010?
No, 2004.
2004.
So the first reg was 4, but I think the final reg didn't come into effect until 2010.
What happened, though, to
2010
my
was for
shock,
the
by the
small
way,
companies, right?
That's right, there was a phase-in.
I can never divulge my source, but I'm a GMP lawyer in part. I've done a lot of civil and criminal GMP, and I couldn't understand for the life of me why for 10 years nothing happened until somebody told me in the government that it was the intent of some people very high up in HHS to allow consumers to lose confidence in the industry, because if GMPs came into effect, it would be a quality leveler, and therefore the government would be better off having no GMPs. And that was the courageous act, really, of the then FDA Chief Counsel, Dan Troy, who said, that's enough. The statute says have GMPs, we're going to have GMPs. And the first draft that came out, I think you remember, was 1,000 pages, and it was basically drug GMPs with a little part in the middle cut out on validation. And what it ultimately evolved into is something that we've begged the agency to do more enforcement, but there are budgetary limitations.
Yeah. I have not personally witnessed that, which is disappointing. But in the context of just think about the post-DSHEA period where FDA was shell-shocked, literally shell-shocked. They couldn't believe the bill passed. Recall that there was a repudiation of FDA that was explicitly written into the congressional record and the report of FDA's abuses, and that a provision changed the burden of proof onto FDA in any litigation. Highly unusual, to my knowledge, unprecedented. That was the level of congressional rebuke. Understandably, FDA took that quite personally, and that there were a lot of people there that had been badly stung by how this all turned out. That took time to rectify that internally at FDA, and again, I think we both appreciate, with that fairly wide lens of looking back and dealing with a number of commissioners over the years, this is the best commissioner that I have seen at FDA in my
I would agree with that, both from my pharmaceutical and medical device areas too. I think he's the finest commissioner in my practice, and his chief of staff is somebody who's extremely articulate, understands these areas in depth. And the head of office dietary supplements, the leadership there, as Loren said, is very interested in the dialogue. So I think we're in a different position. The other thing you should know, you asked about GMP, the other thing that's key relates to the 2007, I guess it was passed in 06, adverse event law, because what people don't realize is FDA made a conscious decision, to Loren's point. In August of '96, there was a famous hearing on ephedra, at which FDA basically announced to the press, which is why you have the bad press to this day, that the Dietary Supplement Act tied FDA's hands behind their back and there's nothing they can do about it, which of course is explicitly opposite of what we wrote in. We gave them emergency powers. But having said that, the press from that day on used that same line to this day, saying it's unregulated. And they had 900 adverse events reports on ephedra. Nobody knew at that time that they were garbage. FDA could have gone into court in 1 week, had an injunction against ephedra forever. But instead, they chose to go to the press and say, we have no power to do anything. And that was, I think, the turning point.
Yeah, I agree. Ephedra was a pimple on the face of the industry that I lament personally.
Yeah. So I wanted to actually talk about ephedra very, very quickly because DSHEA established two entities, right? One was the Office of Dietary Supplements at NIH.
Correct.
And then the other was this Commission on Dietary Supplement Labels, this
Correct.
very short-lived commission, which
Correct.
produced a report which was then sent to various people in government. And in that, they actually write, the Commission urges FDA to use its authority under DSHEA to take swift enforcement action to address potential safety issues such as those posed recently by products containing ephedrine alkaloids. So that's in 1997. They're saying we need to do something, and it was 2002, 2003 before.
Dan Troy again issued a regulation.
Yeah. It was unfortunate that FDA did not use the authority that was granted to deal with that. In retrospect, I think all parties would concur.
Yep. Okay, well let's kind of move on to now then. So the industry, has it evolved the way back in 2005? I mean, you could never have known. The internet, you had no kind of understanding of how the internet would affect dietary supplements when you wrote the law. And so
No.
how was that kind of got ahead of itself? And
That's a great question. It's a little difficult to be objective because you've seen this grow up every day. So it's all familiar, all of the changes in evolution, but if you were to step back from then to now, it would be astonishing. First, just in terms of the sheer size and magnitude. And you can judge that by going to big shows, Expo West as an example, other events. The second part is who you see, that there's a whole lot more suits and ties than we used to see. And there's a great deal of money that's very interested to participate in the industry. The personality has changed quite a lot. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that those who own the industry have their own personal and corporate and financial objectives. This has always been an industry that has been based on a sense of the commons and community, and that means that you invest at least as much, if not a bit more, than you receive from it. That would be my greatest concern, is that the desire to contribute to the community is not what it was. And more we hear people ask, who are we? We are them, the them being those that we were dealing with 25 years ago, big food, big pharma. And big food, big pharma are extremely interested in what we have to offer, as are the consumers for all of us. That would be my biggest concern, is can we maintain our integrity as I would say a philosophy, an approach to life and health. Is there the political will and the expertise resident in the industry today to engage in what looks to be a relook at DSHEA? The head count is low, not without significance. And Senator Hatch is retired. Chairman Dingell passed away very recently. There are no remaining members of Congress that were directly involved in DSHEA. That's now over. There are no staffers, to my knowledge, as well. So the DNA strand has run out to some degree. And now with a highly divided and bipartisan, a partisan Congress, the prospect of trying to get something meaningful done is an exhausting thought.
so the kind of the path of optimism is through Gottlieb and some of the things that he's
Well,
talking
partially, I would say engagement through Gottlieb and through Office of Dietary Supplements. But I share Loren's fundamental concern very much. But my view is that I think it's now a combination. I gave up on the people who had a cause and built companies around the cause, because there are only a few of those left. Loren and I are still extremely active and taking leadership positions to keep people from misbehaving, essentially, as well as trying to move innovation forward. But I'm not bothered by the fact that you have large, responsible companies who are willing to invest money if they see there's a reason to in safety studies or substantiation and globalizing. And it's my view, the reason I'm optimistic is I think I take from Commissioner Gottlieb's statement this week a recognition and agreement that we're not going to have a dietary supplement industry 10 years from now. We're going to have what people have been talking about, which is a functional food industry. Medical foods, which are regulated by FDA with a 30-year out-of-date scheme that has nothing to do with the market or the science that's emerging. Intellectual property and exclusivity on the table, which I think FDA would be willing to listen to, are proposals to create exclusivities or some incentives for companies to invest. We've put forth a proposal that if a company spends a lot of money on safety, FDA can't allow another company on until they do an equal quality safety, what we call a de facto exclusivity. So there are a lot of ways to move this, and I actually think as long as you have Loren around and certain other people who care, because the company people aren't there for the most part, I think we can fashion something good, and if it is, I think there are a lot of responsible companies, say in the OTC industry, who would want to invest and are investing. But the interesting thing is what I don't find tolerable is the vestigial concerns of people who are hiding behind things like we don't trust FDA, so we don't want to grow up, when really all they're trying to do is eke out some more income with low-grade products or poor quality. And that part, I think both of us share that view. We've talked about this. You know, it's one thing to legitimately to be a small business person who needs a little easier go in order to make it. It's a different thing to be a company in business for a long time that doesn't want to spend the money to upgrade. And that's what a lot of the opposition is now to growing up.
I mean, you and I have talked about this. Like, there's a lot of people making a lot of money in this industry. I mean, it's a very profitable industry, right? And when DSHEA, those early seeds or sparks for DSHEA, there was clear moments where you're like, this is where the movement started. Whereas today, there doesn't feel like that. There's not that kind of inflection point or that crisis that would spark this. Well, let's take this and do something.
That's true. Yeah, that's the sense of urgency doesn't exist for sure. The sense of opportunity might be the working equivalent today. Is that those that say, why can't we, and then fill in the blanks, say more about our products, or this or that. There's a voice that still wishes that there was a traditional medicines category. Mm-hmm. That should be listened to. The big one that's on the table is, how do we integrate dietary supplements and our industry's views? And I would extend that now to medical foods or their equivalents, functional foods of all sorts. How does that really fit into the broader healthcare system?
That's right.
That is the trillion-dollar question. And the opposition ultimately will be one that we have to deal with, is that to get into that system, we have to make some big compromises. That is a debate that we need to have. To me, that is the fundamental go-forward issue for a DSHEA.
In fact, Loren, I think that's the inflection point that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think that the failure of every major healthcare system in the world, and it is in the world, is what's driving the $40 billion market, because people, A, don't want to go to a hospital, and B, can't afford to, so they'll do everything they can to prevent disease or to maintain their health, even if they have a condition, by taking a product. It may not be a dietary supplement, it could be a medical food or FSDU, but it's something.
Yeah.
A faux product,
yeah.
A traditional medicine.
Yeah, this is the eternal river that flows through everyone that really has this understanding of natural health and wellness, is that we're responsible individually. So what are the tools to do that? Well, it was the framework of DSHEA. It's access to what I think is valuable, useful information, high quality standards, a light touch by the regulators to step in when clearly there's misbehavior, and then let people educate themselves and make choices. They won't always be the best decision, but our fundamental view going is it is not the government's responsibility to make sure everybody makes a good decision.
But it is the responsibility of the industry to have a baseline of safety and substantiation, which they're not meeting in large part.
Yeah. I also want to talk about the low barrier to entry, because this is obviously a criticism that's leveled pretty often at the industry. It's far too easy to go out there, find a contract manufacturer, whack some, do a formulation, whack your own label on it, put it on the internet, off you go. And in theory, like, the inspection authority was supposed to address that, facilities registration, NDI notification.
Stop right there.
Okay.
That's the problem. You just put your finger. The problem is the NDI system is not working because of what Loren said. The way it was written is a mess, but also we need a mandatory listing so FDA knows what's on the market, so they know it has to be registered. You cannot go to a contract manufacturer, slap your label on. You need to notify FDA, and FDA has to know what's in there and what the claim is. That isn't happening now. What is it, 1% of companies are filing NDIs who should?
It's a low number.
I mean, it's ridiculous, and that's the part of the system that needs the biggest fix.
But then that's also going back to 1994, right? Because we didn't establish a list of grandfathered ingredients, so we don't. I mean, there are lists from that time,
right,
but none of them are officially recognized.
Right.
Now FDA is kind of scrambling, to maybe.
You know what? That's, to me, I know a lot of people care about that, but no, I mean mandatory listing, meaning let's step up and say, okay, we're proud to be on the market. I mean, just think of the concept. You go into the market, you're selling products to consumers on the internet or in the store, and yet you're not willing to tell anybody you're on the market officially. I mean, it just makes no sense.
Yeah, and this will clearly be one of the go-forward discussions. Things such as mandatory registration of product and facility. That is a global standard, basically, almost in every other country. That provision operates in some way. The U.S. is an exception to that. The consumers' expectations have evolved and changed, and that would not, I think, be welcomed by consumers. That will be one of those test issues, is have we evolved to a point now where that can be a thoughtful discussion about, okay, how would that work? And that needs to be had, that discussion. But there's a number of things, and I think right now what is fun to think about is if we're really going to put a table out and invite people to sit there and say, what do you think? We better come prepared with some very clear and specific ideas of what we think the future should look like in terms of a statutory framework. I'll be intrigued to see to what degree that the industry reveals its populist side in that, which will be there. It is always there, more quiet than at other times. To see if there's a new generation of leaders that will arise because there's an opportunity now to be a leader in a new way is the old, I guess it's an old saying of some sort, is that sergeants, colonels, and generals are made on the battlefield. And that will be true here, is that as we look at that legacy group of players that worked so hard together on DSHEA and have remained close friends ever since, is I don't think that the wartime buddy analogy is inappropriate, is that was a brutal 2.5 years. And on the back end of it, it looks like it must have been pretty easy, because here we got the finished tidy statute and there it is. But boy, oh boy, to get from the beginnings of the whole idea, which were laughed at, I mean, openly laughed at by most everybody in Washington, and they just thought, how long is this going to last? In fact, I will digress. The bill was introduced, the original Health Freedom Act in 1992 was introduced in June. There was an FDLI conference in Virginia, just right over the river, and I was at one round table at this big luncheon, and the deputy commissioner was at another, and a guy ran in and whispered in his ear, and I just happened to hear, Senator Hatch has introduced a bill, dietary supplement bill. There was a short pause, and he said, don't worry, it's not going to go anywhere. And it was that dismissive sense of, all right, here it is. none of us could have predicted, where this would have gone. Either the passage of the bill, which itself was a Hail Mary, or that 10 times growth over 25 years, which I think you can directly attribute to a foundation that was solid enough that you can now build some pretty big buildings on it in the form of investments. And it's great that this is being done, is that there has not been a chance for Scott and I to sit down and think about these things for quite a long time. I have a pretty clear idea, though, that we will be once again as we move into this next phase.
Yeah. Now, Scott, you said a couple of times during this past hour or so that the industry hasn't grown up. But would you say, it is growing up, right? There's things that happened over the last 5, 8 years, from whether it's Eric Schneiderman in New York and everything that happened from that. There are conversations, in my opinion, that are now happening in the public sphere that wouldn't have happened, and things that are being considered that wouldn't have been considered maybe 5 years ago because of the extra scrutiny that the industry's been going
I
on.
agree with that in part.
Okay.
Schneiderman, to me, is a one-off. That was a publicity stunt using a DNA test used for dinosaur bones that had nothing to do with herbs. So I don't consider that.
Totally agree.
But I get your point. Your point is that with all the I don't think the scrutiny actually is as bad as it was in the 90s. I actually think it was worse back then. Everything was held up. No, I think there are some people, Loren and I speak to each other, and it's amazing. We're exactly in the same place on every issue, even if he won't admit it. And but the point is that we're impatient. We're impatient because what? Let's take this master listing thing, since that's the hot issue right now. I was shocked to see how many people said, "Well, I'm not sure. FDA might regulate too much." Just think about the fact that you have $40 billion worth of product, and there are companies saying, "I'm not sure I want the government to know I'm selling it." You're willing to sell it to consumers, but you're not willing to list it with the government, so they can go after companies that haven't filed NDIs, that are putting tainted ingredients in and giving us all a bad name. It's just, and I think also the investment side, and that's where I said with Loren, I'm very optimistic, because when you have players like established companies in the OTC drug field, for example, that recognize globally that nutritionals are a large part of the future, they'll spend the time and money to check out a claim, to have some safety tests, and that's not a bad thing. So for the core people for whom, as Loren said, it's still a cause before it's a business, and we admire those people. The fact is, if you have people who are willing to make the rest grow up, I don't think that's anything but positive. And also the government, as Loren said, is now in a position where they're saying, okay, there are a lot of abuses, but we understand the regulatory scheme is now something that may not address, I like the way you put it, the consumer expectations have grown with the market, and I think that's a good point. So I don't think that Schneiderman or a couple of these publicity areas have themselves forced people to grow up. In fact, on the contrary, I still see defensive attitudes. I think it's more just some of the things Loren was reverting to, the additional investment, the globalization, the fact that all of the countries have a scheme where you have to register products, and also that there is a need to expand the category beyond vitamin, mineral, and herb pills to a much broader health paradigm that Loren was referring to that would require a different type of science.
Okay, so I want to kind of tie it up now, because we're into the last couple of minutes. So looking at the industry as of right now, what keeps you up at night when you think about, this law that you both wrote, basically? And then what if you could have one thing or two things that you would add to make this so much better, to take this industry to the next step? Yeah. What would they be?
Two things keep me up. One of them is the incident, where industries all around us, in produce and foods, you see E. coli contaminations, things of this sort. We have had remarkably few such incidents over the years. That concerns me, is that it happens, and it could easily happen to us. Vigilance on the quality compliance is paramount. If that happens, that we will lose an enormous amount of trust and confidence at the consumer level. The other one is CBD and hemp extracts, is what becomes of that. That these are two worlds that are very quickly moving. One is moving much faster toward us than we toward them. That is going to be a very interesting, complicated development to deal with. I suspect that it will end up being put on the table as part of a DSHEA 2.0, if we use that term. That we have to think through how that would work, if it would work. But honestly, it's just an event that really damages the industry as a whole and provokes Congress, who was otherwise distracted, to take a look. And that's not a great way to open a discussion about where we'd like to see things going forward.
Scott?
I think the number one thing that keeps me up is stagnation. This idea that I was mentioning in the context of the industry not being willing to grow up. You have FDA coming out with an announcement that we applaud, but why is it that industry didn't come out with those proposals 5 years ago for self-regulatory help? As Loren said, one of the premises of the DSHEA is we want to treat consumers as smart people who can figure out what's real and what's not real. Our only obligation is to deliver safe products, responsible claims, and to innovate. That's a big ticket, but nonetheless, we're innovating in part, but we're not doing enough to establish that confidence. So I guess it's not one thing, but that is the number one thing that bothers me. And I think the solutions, you asked what two things, as I mentioned, one is a mandatory listing, and the other is recognizing that we're in a much larger health paradigm and it's not just about supplements.
Wonderful. Scott, Loren, I'm so glad we were able to make this happen. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So look out for more coverage of DSHEA coming up on Nutrient Ingredients USA. I've been your host, Stephen Daniels. Thanks for listening.